this. Anything related to storing data is happening on Azure storage. And I'm going to make this really, really simple. By the time we are done with all these sessions, you'll be absolutely comfortable dealing with all this. All right. So let's start with some analogy here. A bit of history. Currently, if you are an enterprise administrator, like a system admin, network admin, or whatever infrastructure admin they call out these days, you know where storage is happening. Back in the days, we'll take a server, put your you'll have a RAID over there, and you'll have local storage on your server. It's just like local storage in your computer. That's where you would store your data. Things changed, a lot of things happened. Fast forward, what we started doing is we needed more flexibility. So if your server's local storage gets full, only option for you to is add more hard drives and extend that storage. And not always that would be the easiest thing to do. You have to copy data over, make sure everything's there. There will be a maintenance window, there'll be a downtime. A lot of things used to happen. So for the flexibility or scalability, what they started doing was we started putting network attached to storage, like a NAS system. Or more enterprisey thing would be a SAN, a storage area network, where you can have as much as storage you want at a moment's notice, as long as your SAN had enough storage over there. So it was a pool of data, bunch of disks and drives together. And it was not only just a storage on SAN, it's also if a drive fails, you'll still be fine. So it's RAID, right? And you would also have these days tier of data. So some of your data will be solid state drives, some of them would be just SATA, and you'd also tier your data based on the kind of performance you want from there. So that's all great on premises. This is how on-premise implementations are dealing with storage. Someone wants an added volume to your server. Somebody wants a file share. Lately, I was working with EMC and as well as HP's storage, where you could have a CIFS on the SAN, so you could actually have a file share directly from the SAN, your storage subsystem, and you did not have to create a file share on a server and spin up another VM or another physical server to do that. So a lot has happened. So Azure Storage serves all of the above and more. So in Azure, you can do everything that we are doing on premises and much, much, much more. So let's get into that. What do I mean by much, much, much more? So Azure Storage is part of an overall thing that's called Azure Data Services. It's a component of Azure. So under data services, you have Azure Storage, you have Azure Site Recovery, Azure Backup, and they're all part of Azure Data Services. Okay, so anywhere you are storing data is going on Azure Storage, or the other two, Site Recovery or Azure Backup. So what's Azure Storage used for? Well, it's used for storing everything. So storing files, you can store website, you can also store virtual machines, right? So in the previous sessions, when we were creating a virtual machine, the storage account that I kept talking about, and we never got into details of that, was that your virtual machine needs to be stored somewhere in Azure. So Azure storage account was where your storage was being stored there. So every time we were creating a virtual machine, we were creating or we used one of the Azure accounts where we are storing all this data. The same happened when we were dealing with Azure websites. You might have noticed that, when we were doing the Azure website, we never really talked about where all this are being stored. If this was on-premises infrastructure, those would be something you would be looking into right now, that, hey, where do I store this data? Well, in Azure Storage account, we were storing the data. So even for the PaaS or platform as a service, you are still using Azure Storage to store all the data, not just only the virtual machines. Okay, so we'll get into the data types in a bit, but let's continue now. So the first thing you need to do in Azure to store data is to create something called as Azure Storage account. Okay, so that's the first thing you need. That we'll have to, in our subscription, we need to create a storage account where things will get stored. Now, with the Azure subscription, and this is 2016 now, you can have multiple storage accounts in a single subscription. So some of you might have a question right now that, why is one storage account where I can store everything, can do everything? right? I mean, why do we need multiple storage accounts? If it's a pool of data and Azure gives you almost unlimited amount of data, I can just have one storage account and put everything there. Yeah, I'll have a little bit of structure there. So I'll get into that in the next slide, where we are going to talk about why you might need separate storage accounts in one single subscription. Okay, but for now, just remember you can have like one multiple storage accounts in your subscription. While recording this video in 2016, I think each storage account, and don't take me on for this one, do a little bit of TechNet searching on this one. I think each storage account has a limitation of something ridiculous like 500 terabytes of data per storage account. So obviously, if you need more than 500 terabytes of data, you'll have to have another storage account in your subscription. So unless you have a need for that, you'll need multiple storage accounts for that. Okay. And creating this as Azure storage account is quite simple. You need a URL, and this is called also an endpoints that will come out of this URL, and I'll get into that later as well. But you'll need an URL. So this is pretty similar to how we used to create cloud service, if you remember. You'd have a name for your storage account, and this name has to be unique. And the reason it has to be unique is because these URLs will have endpoints that might be able to, users might be able to access this from the public domain. So these endpoints have to have an unique URL, and I'll show you how that happens. It will also need a location. So each storage account is located in a single location. So for example, I use Central US or East US 2. You might, depending on which location you are close to, you might have a location where you want to store your data. So that's one thing you have to remember for creating a storage account. And you need an account type, which is the replication option, actually. They call it account type or replication option. There's a little bit of replication going on with this data. In the next slide, we'll see that. So these are the primary three things. There's another thing, the resource group and all that. I'll show you that in the demo. But for creating a storage account, that's all you need. So if you are from what we discussed right now, if you are trying to create a virtual machine right now, and that machine needs to be stored somewhere, ideally in your subscription, if you want to structure this and you are doing this in a corporation in an enterprise level, you probably want to create a storage account first and make sure that that's ready before you go and create a virtual machine. The virtual machine wizard gives you an option to choose an existing storage account to store your virtual machine data, or have the virtual machine VHD located there. Or, as you must have noticed in the previous sessions, when you bring up the virtual machine creation wizard, it gives you an option to create a new storage account if you do not already have one. Chances are in an enterprise environment, you don't want that option because you want all the virtual machines perhaps to be together in one storage account, in one single folder, all organized. So that's something you'll have to know as well. Okay, so let's move on. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the storage account details here, like what does the URL mean, the location mean, as well as the account type. The most important one for your real life implementations as well as exam will be the replication option. So let's deep dive into that a little bit. So account types, which really mean replication options in a storage accounts context. Okay, so there are four, actually there are five, but there are four we want to discuss about here, and the fifth one I'll talk to you when I give the demo and why this is not part of this yet. As far as your exam is concerned, remember this for now. Like some of you know, Azure is moving fast forward at such a speed. They keep adding more stuff and it's hard to keep up. But the exam, the way it works is it takes a snapshot of time and it says this is exactly what's going to be on your exam. So remember this, but I want these videos to be very real life as well. So I'll explore the fifth option with you once we get to the demo. So when you are creating a storage account, you are basically creating a little space. So, if you are thinking in a SAN point of view, it's basically carving or it's creating a LUN for you in the back end. It's like a volume, right? In a server term, the whole LUN thing is like a volume that you are creating. So when you're creating a storage account, think of that way, that you are carving a volume. But in SAN, what happens is that on premises, in your storage area network, you will already have the SAN configured in such a way that you will think that does this server need this 100 gigs of data? Should this data be on SATA drives or solid state drives? What kind of storage will it be on? So you can handle that from the back end, obviously, right? And in Azure, it's almost the same thing. When you are creating this storage, it's asking you that what kind of disks it will be on, for example, and it will also give you that what kind of failover or replication or what kind of data redundancy it should be on as well. So assuming that in your local storage on your server, you will have RAID, and this RAID could be just a mirror that, I'm going to have two hard drives. If data is going to fail in one hard drive, it's going to be fine because the other hard drive still has a data. Or you might have a RAID 5 with parity and data striping, where if multiple disks fail, your data will still be okay. Same thing happens in your NAS as well as your SAN. You still have the RAID concept. The data is going to be all replicated between these disks. So in Azure, we have 4 different ways of doing this, but it is way more advanced and robust, and I'll explain how. So your first option, and this is probably the cheapest option that you have, is locally redundant or standard underscore LRS, locally redundant storage. You need to know the standard underscore LRS in the brackets over there or the parentheses, because this is what PowerShell uses to identify these storage types or these replication options. Okay, so you can always refer to this one, and I'll show you how to find that out from PowerShell as well. So locally redundant storage, it's basically saying we know that in Azure data centers or Azure regions or locations, this is how it is. You have a region or a location, for example, East USA. In East USA location, you might have multiple facilities or multiple data centers. So you might have 2 data centers in East US locations, okay? So in locally redundant, it's saying that 3 data copies in single facility in single location. Here, single facility means in a single data center in a single location. So if you're choosing the locally redundant, your data will be in one data center. In one data center, it will be 3 different copies. Okay. So somehow, if your data that is residing on this storage system in the data center breaks, there are still 2 other copies in the same data center in the same location. Okay, this is great. It's one of the cheapest because the data still stays in the same data center. It does not even go out of the data center. But it is most likely already redundant than what you have on premise. Right? In on premise, you probably just have one SAN with a RAID and everything. But what happens if that whole SAN system breaks? You are pretty much done. This is similar to having multiple or 3 SANs in one data center, and this data is located in all 3 of them. Pretty redundant already. But Azure, like everything else, take this a little bit further. Then you have the zone redundant or standard underscore ZRS. So what this one says is that I'm going to have 3 data copies in 2 or 3 facilities or data centers in a single location. So if you are going to store the data in East USA location, what it will do is in East location, like I said, it could have 2 or 3 data centers which are completely separate from each other. They're going to have these 3 copies in like these 3 data centers. So you are now leaving the entire data center. So forget even the servers, forget even the SANs. If your entire data center breaks, you have your data in another data center in the same region. Means you are still in East USA in 3 separate data centers with your data. Very highly redundant. Some of you spend a lot of money on premises to actually have some kind of implementation like that. But in Azure, it's just like a click to make sure your data is replicated like that. The little catch with the zone redundant is it's only for blob storage. Or I'll get to what these storage types are, but it's only for blob, and you have to remember that. In real life, if you're trying to have like a table data or queue data, you can't do that. But for most people, blob storage is all you need, and this is great because now you already have redundancy. But it's still going to be in the same geographical area. Okay. The next one is geo-redundant or standard GRS. This is amazing. And it's the most resilient of all storage because this one actually takes care of your DR scenarios. So Your geo-redundant storage type is LRS, which is locally redundant. You have 3 copies in a single data center already in the same location, plus 3 data copies stored in a secondary location. So what's happening here? In East USA, you are going to have your data in the data center with 3 copies, as well as now it will have another 3 copy of your same data in a totally different location geographically, and that location could be West USA, it could be anywhere else, any other data center, okay? But it's just not going to be in the same region. So guess what? It already took care of your storage subsystems DR or disaster recovery. What happens if all of West USA has this huge disaster at the data center and everything is broke? Oh, heaven forbid that ever happens. But just imagine if that happens, it actually will have data in another geographical location in a different side, like east of the US coast, where your data is going to be located. So it happens to be one of the most resilient because this data is copied so many times in so many places. So it's the most resilient. It's expensive as well. And the fourth one, it's read access geo-redundant or standard RAGRS is the same as GRS. You're going to have 3 copies in a local data center, 3 copies in a different region or location in a local data center. But the difference with read access geo-redundant is if there is a failover situation, like if ever there is an issue where there is a failure in one of the locations, the other location is not going to give you a read-write option. It's only going to give you a read-only option. So all the options or the replication options that we have seen over here gives you a read-write, both access to your storage. Doesn't matter if it's in one data center or the other data center, one location or the other location. But there might be a reason where you think that I'm going to replicate this data to a different location, but in case there is a failover in my primary region, my secondary region is only going to have a read-only access. I am quite sure there are business reasons for this. You might want to make sure that when you are in a failover state, people are not really writing data because you guys are trying to get over, I don't know, you're going to recover from all this disaster and everything, but you want to make sure nobody's writing any data to your systems during that time. You might have a business reason for that. Okay, so these are the 4 replication options of your data that Azure Storage provides. The 5th one, and I'll show this one in the demo, it's actually premium storage. With premium storage, your storage subsystem is faster. There's solid state drives. It's not part of this, but there is a premium storage option as well. Your subscription actually has to have access to that, and you might have to request Microsoft support to provide you with premium storage option. You just have to basically open a ticket and be like, hey, I need premium storage for whatever I'm trying to do, and they'll enable that for you so you can store data in premium storage for people who are looking for higher IOPS with solid state drives and things like that. So there is a 5th option there. Um, Another important thing I want you to take away from this is that each storage account can have a single replication option. This is where you'll find out why we might need multiple storage accounts. So your one storage account can have only one replication option. So if you have one storage account where you are keeping all your virtual hard disk drives or the VHDs, if you have an account which is locally redundant, that's all the type of replication you can have in that storage account. You can still store other type of data. Don't get me wrong. You can store files and folders and everything else, but it will only be locally redundant. You cannot have a storage account and be like, I want part of this data to be locally redundant or part of this data to be zone redundant. You can't. So for that, you'll have to have another storage account where you will specify the replication option. So that's another reason you might need multiple account types or multiple storage accounts with different replication options depending on the kind of data. So I'll give you one very nice example for enterprise people out there is that you create a server, a VM, and it's using locally redundant, which is great. 3 copies of data in the same data center. You do not have any specific disaster recovery plans besides the single zone or single location. But the data you put in that server on another volume, like a volume D or volume E or whatever, that data needs to be replicated, from one region to another region. You have to make sure you have that data replicated somewhere else, which is not in the same location. Let's think that it's a compliance requirement or it's a corporate requirement. So you can actually have your server be on a storage account and another storage that needs to be there attached to it, where the data is going to be replicated using another storage account. So you can do that. There are nice fancy ways to do that, to store that kind of data. Okay, so those are the reasons you might have different account types, like I'm mentioning. Okay, so that's cool. So let's move on. And we'll come to the types of storage in storage accounts. I probably don't need to show you this before I jump into a demo, but I thought that it's important to understand the types of storage you have. So we created a storage account. We chose our account type or our replication option. Now I'm telling you the kind of data you can actually put in there. Okay, for most of you might not care, but there's a lot of you who might care as well, depending on the type of storage you are trying to do. Because exam wise, or I have to assume that some of you are going to use this as infrastructure as a service storage. Some of you might actually use this as a PaaS or platform as a service storage and things like that. So let's deep dive into that. So we have four kind of storage or four kind of things that you can store in your storage accounts. One, and the most important and the common one, is the blob storage. I mean, if you're doing infrastructure as a service, this is what you'll be mostly using all the time. In fact, most of our sessions, we have been using this so far. Okay, so in blob storage, blob, which is binary large objects, that's what it stands for. It's basically for any type of unstructured data. Unstructured over here really means files or binary data, documents, images, videos, logs, even virtual hard drives. These are surprisingly unstructured data. Means these are the kind of data that do not follow any structure. You have different kind of files, different kind of file types, all can be stored in this one bucket. Okay, so this is what blob storage is. These are text files or binary data files, VHDs. When you create a VM, it's all blob storage. Okay, and this is what we have been using so far. Then you have a table storage. Table storage is, if you are familiar and a developer and familiar with SQL, you'll understand what table storage is. It's basically relational data you're putting in a table, right? However, there's a little difference with table storage here, and do not confuse this with Azure's PaaS offering of SQL. Okay, if you are doing all of that, this is not that. Table storage is something similar where you have a storage where you have multiple tables. But the data in this table do not follow a schema. I know the SQL guys are going crazy right now. What do you mean no schema? Well, this data is going to be in a table, but it does not have to have any schema or structure. So I might have data where I have my first name, last name, and my address. And the second record might be first name, last name, address, and all of a sudden it will also have something like my sex, right? So it is structured, but it does not have any schema. Like there's no strong type, and these are table storage. You are storing this data in a table. And the reason you need this kind of storage is for developers who are actually doing a prototyping, or they're just working on an environment where the data type is changing really fast. You do not know how much more data or information you're going to put in there. So you're just rapidly developing an data which requires tables, and you are not set on a schema yet, but you want to store that. So you can store that in Azure storage as a table as a table storage in Azure storage accounts. Okay. Then you have the queue storage. A lot of infrastructure people might not be familiar with what these queues are, but you developers will be perfectly comfortable, or should be comfortable, with what queuing is. So what happens is, just to give you a little feedback in a very, very simplest terms, is that distributed applications might need to communicate with each other. And one of the ways it communicates is using a queue mechanism. So if one process is trying to communicate with another process or another service, and you have a constant flow of data that is coming in, the destination process or service might not be fast enough to process all this data when, let's assume that there is a transaction going on 1,000 times per second, for example, for some big banks or things like that. So what will happen is all these instructions or all these things will be stored in a queue to be processed by the service at the destination at a certain amount of after a certain amount of time passes. That it takes this data, or this transaction, it does something on it, done. It takes the next transaction, so it will go into the queue storage and find out all that things are there in the queue and start processing them one at a time, or how many it can handle at a single time. But it requires this storage to store this communication somewhere. And one of the reasons they would actually do this queue storage, just to go into a little bit of a detail, is if you have thousands of transactions and the service cannot handle it, you don't want these transactions to fail. You just want them to wait, right? And you want them to wait for the other transactions to happen when this is done. And Azure storage account can store this queue data for you. And that's one of the things. Now, the next one, and this is going to be really interesting for the infrastructure guys, is the file storage. It's like a file share. So you can use your Azure storage account like completely a file share. Think of it as a file server. Okay. So if you are on a virtual machine or a client computer, you can actually map a drive to get to this file storage. Back in the days, oh well, not back in the days, even today, you have file servers, which does nothing but people go there and they map the file share through an UNC path on their computer as a map drive. So they go over there, they have access to all these files. So Azure storage, and this used to be preview, now it's public right now, has something called as file storage. So you can use your Azure storage account to store this as an SMB share or a file share, and you can literally go to these virtual machines and just be like, hey, map a drive, take this is the UNC path, connect to it, and you have access to all that. I have been using this file storage quite a bit, and I'll tell you how. So I do a lot of POC, proof of concepts, and things like that. And for example, I have to download all the ISO files for example, SQL, SharePoint, Exchange, and all that. So what I did was in my Azure account, I have a storage account which is like a file storage where I kept all these ISO files. So it doesn't matter if I destroy all these virtual machines, I do not have to download all these ISO files all the time. I just have to map the drive and pretty much get the ISO files from there. Okay, and it's cheaper in the long run because I'm not downloading all this data all this time, and Azure storage is quite cheap. So if I even store like about 200 300 gigs of ISO files, it doesn't really cost a whole lot, few bucks a month. So it's not really that bad for the kind of work I do. So that's one thing I've been using from a prototyping or proof of concepts all the time. You might have something similar in your organization, and you can do all of that. And with this file storage, you can also do different kind of access, like how you want to access this data, and who has permissions to access this data. And we'll definitely get into a demo in that in the future and show you how that is done. Okay. All right, so let's move on. The last thing I want to talk about before we jump into a demo is Azure Data Account endpoints. Now that we know the kind of four storages you can store in, four storage things that you can store in Azure account, I want to talk about a little bit of creating the account and the URL. You remember in the back end, I had this URL thing where I said when you create a storage account, you need to put in a URL and what happens. Let's actually see that. Let me grab my pointer here. So when you create a storage account, it will already have a provision for this four storage types, right? You have a blob storage, table, queue, and file. We just discussed that. So this is going to be your account name. This is going to be unique, and now it will make sense why it will need to be unique, because each storage type will have an endpoint, how your storage is going to be consumed or accessed. So for blob storage, let's say I'm going to have a storage name called Ranger Store. That's my account name. So it will be HTTPS or HTTP. By the way, it does it both. Over here, I'm obviously showing you the secure way of doing this, but you could access this with HTTP as well. So make your application use HTTPS is the secure way to do it. So HTTPS rangerstore.blob.core.windows.net. So by looking at this, you know that this endpoint will only access the blob storage. Okay. So then you can have the table name. It will be the same. It will be table for the queue. It will be queue for the file. It will be file. But it will always have the account name in the URL to exactly identify which storage this is. It's pretty interesting with these endpoints because if you're writing an application, the application might use table or queue storage or file. When you need to create the UNC path, you can actually take the UNC path out of this URL. Some of you might be wondering, hang on a second. You're telling me blob storage is where I put all my virtual hard drives for my VMs or my files and everything. What happens if I really go to this URL? Do I have access to this data publicly? Because that kind of defies all purpose of security because the data is available online. Do not worry about that. Those are the endpoints, but there are security stuff in place. So if you actually just have a blob storage, so you know you have like a /VHD /myvm.vhd, no, you are not going to be able to access that directly because there is security in place to make sure that you can't. But there is also provision in place to make sure that you can if you really want to. So just like OneDrive public, you remember in OneDrive you have this option where you can make this entire folder as a public folder where everybody can access that. Well, guess what? This is how they're most likely doing it. You are going to have a storage account where you are making it public, and in the back end, it's going to an URL like that where you can see all the data stored there. Or you cannot see all the data that are stored there because you have the right storage access in place. So by default, it's not going to be public. I'm going to show you the details in a bit on what that is. All right, I think I've talked quite a bit in the last half an hour. Let's go ahead, jump into my client system in my Azure subscription, and I'm going to show you what I'm going to, or how we can do some of this and get you started with a storage account so you can take care of this. There are two things I want to mention. First of all, one is that I'm not going to use the classic portal that we always use, the manage.windowsazure.com or whatever that was. I'm going to use the new Azure portal, which used to be preview, but that's now final and it's generally available to everybody. I'm going to use that portal, and I think you should be as well. That's where things are happening. That's where Microsoft is supporting most of the things. Okay, so I'm going to use the new portal. And the second thing I'm going to absolutely make sure you understand is this: for this exam, there are two models out there in Azure right now. One is a classic model of deployment, and another one is actually a resource manager deployment model. If you do not know what it is, you really need to look that up. What is the difference between a classic deployment model in Azure and a resource manager model? But your exam right now, with the storage point of view, for now in 2016, it's actually almost the end of January 2016. But I mean, right now it's all classic model, so everything I'm going to deploy is going to be in a classic model. The newer model is the resource manager. It's almost similar, but there are architectural differences that makes it completely different in the back end as well. So that you can do on your own time, or I'll have a different video. But for the sessions we have here, it's going to follow the Microsoft MOC official curriculum, which is still using the classic model. Okay, and I'll show you the difference in the portal as well, what I really mean. So let's jump into the portal. Alrighty, so I'm in my portal right now. It's portal.azure.com. If you recall, there is to be a preview thing written over here somewhere. It's gone right now. So this is no longer in portal. This is the newer portal, okay? And this is where you are. I'm logged into my subscription. The thing that I'm going to do right now, and if you go to all resources here, you'll see my subscription is empty. There's no resource to display. There's nothing. It's like almost a brand new subscription. This is where ideally you would be with your trial account, right? And depending on where you are using this, you might have other resources as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a storage account before anything. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to go to new. In new over here, I'm going to go under data plus storage. This is where the storage account will be created. And if you come over here, scroll down a little bit, there's something called as a storage account. Use blobs, table, queues, and files for reliable, economical cloud storage. This is exactly what you want. That's what we were talking about. You need a storage account first. Let's click on that. This is where it actually makes a difference. So look over here. It's actually asking you, select a deployment model, and by default there is a resource manager model. You can click a little bit over here and go to learn more and find out what resource manager for new workloads are and what it is. We are going to go use the classic model over here because that's what the exams covering right now, that's what most of you people might already have out there, so that's fine. Let's go ahead and create a classic storage account. Let's go click on create here. It's going to bring another pane and it's going to ask us given that wizard. So you remember the URLs that we talked about, core.windows.net, this is where it will start coming out of, right? So it's asking for that unique name. So if I do something like, I know it's going to be taken for sure, it's like Microsoft. Let's see if it's taken or not. And click outside. It actually tells you over here the storage account Microsoft is not available. And this is again the same explanation I have, that it has to be unique because you might be able to access or might need to be able to access this publicly. So it has to be something unique. So I'm going to put Ranger Store 123. I'm assuming nobody has that yet. Click outside. It's okay. So it's a green check mark over here. So I know that this storage account is not taken. Alrighty, now it's asking for the type. This type is actually replication type, right? And the one that we are talking about. You see that standard RAGRS? So by default, is doing the most resilient ones. And well, it's doing the resilient one with the read access, right? The last option of the fourth one we had was RAGRS. Let's click on that. By default, it gets that. But I do not want that. One, because for this demo, it's probably going to be a little expensive. And the other thing is that it will actually show you the one over here. So the one we are taking is read access geo redundant. It's 742, cost per 100 gigs. It's, yeah, well, for 100 gigs of data, it's only 742 Canadian dollars. It's actually pretty cheap, but even cheaper than that is locally redundant. But you can actually see that what's included in locally redundant. So I can have a block and page blobs, table, queues, 500 maximum IOPS on this disk, 99.99, well, 99.9 my SLA. So most of them are going to be same. With geo-redundant, it actually says read access to secondary only. So this is not going to be read write. So there are some differences over here. So I told you there's four, and there's the fifth one, which is premium locally redundant. So it's locally redundant, but it's going to be on premium storage. Do you want to see what's the difference? Look at this. The regular locally redundant has 500 IOPS. The premium locally redundant disk has 5,000 IOPS. Wow, like that's 10 times more than the regular locally redundant you have. So this is for, I don't know, some of you might require SQL database to be on a very fast IOPS based on your data. So this is like $292 for per 100 gigs, and this one for only 128 gigs is $23. That's quite a big of a jump over here. So you can see how expensive this is, because this is on really, really fast SSDs, or pool of high IOPS data over there. So anyways, for our and you have to be sure, I mean, you have to be absolutely sure that what kind of architectural decisions you need to take, that needs to take place when you choose this data. For my demonstration purpose, I'll take the cheapest one, which is locally redundant, and I'll go select. See, change to standard -LRS, which is great. So I have my storage account. I have this. My Visual Studio Enterprise with MSDN is the subscription name. You'll have your subscription name here. Resource groups, we have chatted before. You do need a resource group where all things are going to be located. So for Classic, the resource group used to be created at the backend. Resource group is actually very important, resource manager model of deployment. In this one, I'm going to just give it Ranger resource group. It's a random resource group that I'm going to put in where all my workloads are. So resource group is just grouping all the workloads together. I'm going to just choose Central US on my subscription, pin to dashboard. I do not want. So that's all that is required for a storage account to be created. Okay, we did not put any data in here. Nothing is happening in here. It's just creating the data. So it's deployment started. Let me give it some time. It doesn't take too long actually to finish that, but I'll come back when it's done. All right, looks like the deployment was done. If anybody was looking at the clock here, it was 12:10 p.m. It's 12:11, so it took like a minute to actually deploy the resource group over there. So let's go to all resources over here and see the resources I have. So Ranger Store 123 was my name for my storage account, and it actually is telling you over here that it's classic. Okay, it's a storage account which is a classic model, location where this storage account is as well, and that's it. So let's go click on that and see the details we can find out from the storage account. We currently do not have any data in there. Okay, so it's actually telling you the type. It's a standard LRS, so it's locally redundant storage. So that means it's got 3 copies in the single data center in a single region. This is the name, this is the location, it's available right now. And it tells you the blobs, the files, the tables and queues, the 4 types of storage that you can have over there. But it opened all settings of the properties here directly. So let's go in that. So if I go to the properties here of this storage account, it gives few details. It's online, the account type, location, primary status is available, last geo-replication failover never. So this is never going to happen because we do not have any geo-replication enabled. And these are the endpoints. So if you recall, the endpoints that we were talking about was HTTPS, your account name, .blob.core, the windows.net. So it's telling you by default, these 4 endpoints were already created for your storage. So it's ready to go. It's got a resource group, resource ID, subscription name. Those are the details. So if you are a developer, you need the queue service endpoint or table, or you are creating that map for the network drive file service endpoint, you can actually take those from here, right? I mean, this is where you come to take the URL. And once you work with this too much, I don't even come here because I sort of know it's always going to be my storage name.blob, so I can just pretty much figure that. There's something called as keys over here. These keys are the one which I was mentioning about having access to this. So if you are going and creating any table data or queue data or even using codes to access your data, you will need the connection strings or you'll need the primary and secondary access key. These are the keys that actually protects your data online. Unless you have access to this key, there's no way you can access this data publicly just like that. You have to use something else to get to this key. I mean, use this key to get to those storage, right? So this is one of the security mechanisms that are there. We'll get into details of the access keys and how to access data with that later in different things. Storage account type, let's go over there. It will actually show you that this is locally redundant or this is the standard LRS that we were using, and there are all the other options over here, right? There are stuff that I have that's not available for me. The premium locally redundant over here, I do not have access to. So this is showing you your replication type. That's the replication type we have right now. Okay. You can have one replication type at a time. So you can perhaps change that, but right now you just have locally redundant. You cannot have 2 of them together, like I mentioned. Custom domains, this is not something we have touched. Custom domains is when you want to actually, rather than having the rangerstore.blob.core.net, you can associate a custom domain or your domain with this storage, maybe for your developers to make things easier or to do whatever thing, right? There is a way you can associate a custom domain, and we'll go through that in a future session over there. Okay, and then you have a bunch of monitoring. I'm not going to get into details over here. You have diagnostic audit logs. You can actually see who has been accessing what. You can have alert rules to let you know what's going on there as well. This is something we'll go in the session when we talk about monitoring and alerting of storage accounts. All right, let's go click on the services. So it's a blob service. I want to click on that. We are not going to get into this in this session, but it actually shows you how to go store data. So it just says you don't have any containers yet for the blob storage. So it basically tells you or gives you more details of these storage types, blobs, files, tables, queues, and all that. Okay, so that's one thing you can do to actually access that. And in the next session, this will be more important, where we'll be going through each and every data type and see what we can do there. So that's all that is to there for storage accounts, and we are going to jump into PowerShell to see how to do this in PowerShell, just when you thought you were done. All right, so this is how in PowerShell you can actually create a storage account. It's very simple. You put storage account name, you put the location, and the type is a standard underscore LRS. Okay, so I'm saying by default, I want this storage account to be a locally redundant storage. You can ignore this if you really want to. This will still work. So it will put a default storage account type. If you remember when we were creating it, by default it picked one up. It will pick a default one. It might be the read access geo redundant, most likely. That's one it will pick by default. So I'm saying that no, I'm going to have the type over there mentioned when I'm doing this, right? So I don't want to I don't want to, I want to specify, I don't want to pick up a default one. So before we create one, let's actually go and see the one we already have. And you do that with get Azure storage account commandlet. So let's go ahead and run only that. This is where you come to run this. Let's go ahead and run that. We will see the one we already had created, which is what? In Central USA, we created one. It was called Ranger Store 123. These are the endpoints. These are the account types, replication. So it gives you a bunch of information to actually see what you have right now. So that is get Azure storage account. So let's go ahead and create one. So I'm going to do exactly what we did in the portal, and you do that with new Azure storage account. It's very understandable. So let's take only this line, and you can actually just create over here, and it will, if you click on this one, run selection, it will do that. But I like highlighting this just to make sure that I'm absolutely doing this one. So run selection. It takes a little bit of time while this happens to create that for you. So when we do get Azure storage account, it will show you now there are two accounts, and I'll show you from the portal as well. But before I do that, you remember I mentioned that how do you get this kind of information? Like, I mean, yeah, you can go to TechNet or you can watch my videos and figure that out. You can Bing it, Google it, whatever you do. But how you can find that? I'll show you a nice trick over here. And this is how sometimes I do this in a very fast way. So in any command, so if you have a command let that is new Azure, for the ones who already know this, it's not a big deal. You probably know what I'm talking about. But what I do is I come home over here, I do help, and it will give you the help on this account. It will show you what this commandlet can actually do. In this one, it's not obviously giving me more. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and do help, and it's giving you an option over here with detailed. Okay, so I want detailed information or full information, all that. So detailed and full, it will give you more information about that commandlet, right? So let's do detailed. In detailed, it's telling you all the switches or parameters that you have. So we used storage account, we used location, you can use label. There are a bunch of stuff that are like, that are not compulsory. I mean, you don't have to put them there, but they're there. So you can see over here, I have type standard LRS, but it's telling you in type what are the ones you can actually put there. So you can put a standard LRS, you can do ZRS, the zone redundant, geo redundant, read only geo redundant. And remember the fifth one I talked about is the premium locally redundant. So this is the fifth one you can put over there too. So by doing this help and detailed, you can actually find more information or more things you can put in the parameters over here. So I picked up the standard underscore LRS from there for our account over here. Anyways, so that's one pretty nice way to actually figure that out and, get more details about these parameters. You can, of course, go to TechNet and do that. Sometimes I just like being over here. I'm so involved in the PowerShell console that I'll just go there and get all the information. So let's wait for this one to happen here. It takes about a minute, so I'm going to pause this a bit. Obviously, surprisingly, it's taking a long time for this to happen. All right, let this happen in the back end. Actually, we need to go back to the slides to cover more stuff. So I'm going to keep this up and running over here. This is definitely taking longer than I expected from the portal for sure. So anyways, it's not created yet, but it's doing that. So let's go back to our slides here. And I want to just touch base on two things because this is part of the Azure data services. There's two other things. One is a Azure site recovery, or disaster recovery in general, and Azure backups of what these are. Okay. So Azure Site Recovery, it's an amazing thing, which is the entire DR thing we used to do on premises. But it takes a lot of planning, a lot of infrastructure in place, and a lot of moving parts that needs to happen. But Azure makes this very, very simple. With Azure Site Recovery, you can protect your virtual machines or physical servers, or even your entire Hyper-V or VMware infrastructure on premises to Azure or another data center. So technically, if someone says these virtual machines, which you have on premises right now, needs to be on a DR location, you just enable the service. It obviously, there is cost associated with it. What it does is that it will take this entire virtual machine and it will take the data, take everything there and put it on Azure. or it could be another data center that you have. So Azure will coordinate this for you. Azure Site Recovery will coordinate this for you and take the data and take it to Azure or another data center for you. So there's a lot of moving parts that happen in the back end, but Azure says that they will handle it for you, and they make it really, really, really simple. So you're basically protecting virtual machines, and these virtual machines, when primarily Azure Site Recovery came out, it used to be only Hyper-V virtual machines with or without SCMM. So SCVMM actually, sorry, there's a typo there, virtual machine manager. It does not have to be on a virtual machine manager, okay? Or it could be a VM on a VMware implementation as well. It does not have to be Hyper-V. It can be a vSphere or VMware. Or it can be an entire physical server that you kind of replicate to a DR location, okay? And like I mentioned, the secondary site can be in Azure or a data center. That's your data center. So you have a data center in Toronto, you have another data center in British Columbia, for example, or somewhere, in New York. All you have to do is use the Azure Site Recovery, point the data, and tell them where you want this located. They'll do in the backends. There's a lot going on there. I make it sound simple, but Azure does a lot through virtual machine replication. It could use always on from SQL to replicate your SQL data. There's a lot of things that happens in the backend, and we will go through this in a future session, but I just wanted to give you a brief introduction of Azure Site Recovery. If any one of you who's involved in infrastructure and have done a DR site before, you'll really appreciate this service, because you know how many things you have to do for a DR site to be up and running. You need to have the VPN tunnel, you need to have another infrastructure over there, power redundancy, everything else. Azure does that for you, okay? And then there is Azure Backups. I like this, all right? So I mean, it's not the most robust out there, but I like it. What it does is that it basically makes Azure as one of your backup mediums. So rather than having a hard disk drive where you're doing this, or most organizations, they do backups on tapes, you can say, I want to do the entire thing on Azure storage. Okay. So what you basically do is create an Azure Vault, and you get the Vault credentials, and then you download an Azure backup agent on your server. So if you have a server called Server 1 and you want to back up the data of the server to Azure, what you'll do is you download the backup agent, and you basically put the Vault credentials that you created on Azure, and you run Windows Backup. Yeah, you run Windows Backup to configure and schedule the backups. You don't use anything fancy. The backup agent, what it does is it creates this destination type or data destination in your Windows Backup. So in Windows Backup, you'll all of a sudden find an option where it gives you a destination to save that data on Microsoft Azure. And at that point, you put in the credentials that you downloaded from the vault, and you take a backup of your server or the data on the server, and it will be stored in Azure. It works great. I have a bunch of servers that I back up through this method. I just go and put in all the data in Azure. It can sit over there in the vault. It's very secure, and I do that. A couple of things for you to remember is that if you are doing Azure Backup, or if you are doing Azure Site Recovery, do not forget that there are rules and regulations that are in place where you can store data, right? So for now in Canada, you cannot store government personally identifiable data in USA. There are, in Ontario at least, there are regulations that you cannot. So you cannot take people's information as a database and store them in Azure Backups, because we do not yet have a data center in Canada for Azure. There are two on the way that are being made in Toronto as well in Montreal. We do not have a final date on the release yet. So the closest for me is East US 2, which is not located in Canada, it's in USA. So there are regulations that prevent you from storing data. So be careful, or make sure you understand your regulations before you go do that, because you might be violating some regulation somewhere if you do that. If you do not have it, it's a private organization. This is absolutely secure to do so, because you're creating a secure vault. Nobody has access to that, and it's great. So you can do Azure Site Recovery and backup that way. I will have a future session which will go and do that. We'll get into details and go through a demo on how exactly you do that. Cool. I think that's all I have from part one introduction. Actually, I'm curious if the Azure account was created from PowerShell. Let's go and see. All resources. Let me go over here. Oh, it's done. Good, good, good. So looks like it succeeded. It definitely took more time than I initially thought it's going to take. So let's do a get Azure account. I want to run this and I want to see what it tells right now. It should show us there are two accounts. Sorry, this is a little out of band. I usually wait for showing this, but okay. So I have one over here, which is Ranger Store 123 and Ranger Store 456. This is there as well. Okay, so if I come over here, all right, I created all resources. As you can see, it has Ranger Store 123 and Ranger Store 456. They both were created over here and both are classic. So that was the way you can actually do this in PowerShell as well. Cool. So anyway,